Hello, and welcome to another talk on birth rates. This is Kim Anderson, and today I want to talk about the replacement rate. This is a really common topic in population discussions, and similar to the total fertility rate, I do think it's an idea that doesn't have a whole lot of value. A lot of people see the replacement rate, or they've been told that this is the level of fertility rate that we need to have in order to have a stable population. And there are a lot of problems with how we look at this and how this is defined. Now, when I looked this up recently, the AI thing gave back a little bit of explanation about how replacement rates are actually not consistent, and the whole idea behind replacement rate is that if you have a certain number of children in your life, then you're basically replacing yourself. That's what it means. The replacement rate is just the replacement of the people that are here with a new group of people. And there are a lot of issues with it. So first of all, replacement rate as a concept can only work globally because we have so much immigration, so many people moving from one place to another, that the idea that we're stable enough in order for a replacement rate to work for a single country doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, the replacement rate is considered to be, I believe, 2.3. I've also seen 2.1, 2.5. I even saw as high as 3.5, depending on where you are in the world. So why is that? Let's just look at that simply. Because normally you would think replacement rate, if you're replacing yourselves and you're two people in a couple, then you would have two children. And that would replace yourselves, right? That actually makes sense. As a replacement rate, what I now think is that 2 really is the replacement rate, in which you would replace your existence on this planet with another human being. Now, the reason it's higher than that is because of the expectation that some people will die. Some people will die young before they have children. And so that 0.1 or 0.3 or whatever it is a way to mitigate the fact that some people die younger than others, right? Again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, because it still ignores a lot of other ideas. So what that means is that replacement rate specifically is based on a specific death rate. And this is a huge problem because both the birth rates and the death rates change a lot. And so the idea that the total fertility rate should be the replacement rate of 2 point something. First of all, and I've gone over this before, I would recommend you watching my video about the total fertility rate versus the crude birth rate to understand the difference between these two. So the total fertility rate of females is what is most commonly used when we look at any kind of birth rate today. Like this is what the number is that we're given, and this is a very misleading number because what it looks like is the average number of children that a person has, but that's not what that number means. It is a very complex formula that's put together that insinuates that the number of children that a woman has will be based on the birth rates of today continuing on into the future the exact same, which doesn't actually happen in reality. So it's a very misleading number. It doesn't represent a snapshot of the average number of children that a woman has or that a person has, right? And already we know for sure that different countries have very different gender ratios. Some have more women than men, some have more men than women. So the total fertility rate of women is not going to give you an accurate representation of what that population will be if they continue to have a skewed gender ratio. And a lot of those skewed gender ratios don't necessarily come from the people that are born there, but they come from certain people either arriving or leaving based on labor needs, based on the economy. So they don't even look at the economy when they're looking at the replacement rate or at the total fertility rate. How could you possibly think that the number of children that a woman has will have any influence on replacing the number of people in that society when a huge number of people in that society are of a specific gender that have moved there in order to work? And so their society will never be replaced in the same way because it's already an artificially manipulated society. So there's so many flaws with this way of thinking. Now, when I did do the breakdown, I wanted to really see, does this actually add up? Does this work? Does the replacement rate lead to a stable population? And the answer to that is kind of. It kind of does. It's not without merit. Okay, so this is just to show the comparison of how many years at replacement rate a country has been in comparison to the population change. So this is from 1950 to 2023. This is all United Nations statistics. This is the percentages over here, 0 to 800% up here. This is 100% down here. So this is 0. So these are all the countries that have had no years at replacement rate. So it's kind of a combination. They could be over or under. I wasn't really looking at that. I was just trying to do a general comparison. So 0, we've got 661% increase in population change from 1950 to 2023. Then we've got 1 to 10 years at replacement rate, 692% increase. 11 to 20 years at replacement rate, 1950 to 2023, that's 330%. 21 to 30 years is 275%. And finally, 31 to 40 years at replacement rate, 186% increase in population change. So you can see that the longer they are at replacement rate, the closer they are to 100%. So it does show that there is some influence of that replacement rate on the population change in general. The replacement rate that I used was 2 to 2.5, just because there are different people who have used different numbers as what they consider to be the replacement rate. Of course, a pure replacement rate would be 2, but this was 2 to 2.5. So it's definitely showing a pretty big influence if they stay at that replacement rate. However, because we are so overpopulated, we really should be looking at a reduction rate and not necessarily a replacement rate. But the other thing that you have to look at from a mathematical perspective is that it matters a lot when people are born and when people die. If you have a society in which children are born to young people, teenagers, and then the average age of death is like 50 something. That is a very different kind of society than when you have another culture where people tend to have children in their 30s and they live until their late 80s, which is, both of these represent cultures that are alive on this planet today, right? And the first snapshot is of a culture that tends to have a very high birth rate. Now, you get into splitting hairs about what causes what. It is a whole lifestyle that people have lived. Probably most of our ancestors, at least through some point of history, lived like that, where they started to have children in their teen years and often died by 60 and, had 10, 12, 15 children, right? This was a lifestyle that many, many people have lived in the past. Now, the new kind of lifestyle, which may have also existed in the past at some point as well, we don't really have enough information about the specifics of people's lifestyle beyond what's been written in books, right? We don't always know that. But the kind of contemporary lifestyle now where you have 2 children in your 30s and you live till your 80s, we can generally see that people that are living that lifestyle are a lot happier. They tend to be a lot healthier. They're able to take in the wealth that they earn through their careers and use it for their own lifestyle and their children in a way without running out as much. Whereas when you live in the other lifestyle where you have children really young and you have many of them, there's a reason why that leads to a shorter lifespan, right? So this is called a demographic shift. So we're seeing everybody move from the short lifespan, high birth rate lifestyle into a low birth rate, high longevity lifestyle, right? Which is positive. I see that as positive, but we need to understand and separate that issue from others. And we also need to understand that the population is way too high to be sustainable. So having a replacement rate now is a terrible idea. We need to have a reduction rate. And the fact is that as our longevity increases, and I went through this in my previous video, as longevity increases, the birth rate will automatically decrease because a birth rate is simply a rate. And the more people you have in that population who haven't died, the more you're adding into the number of total people. Think about one of the common headlines that you see. More American 30-year-old women have no children than any other time in the past. Well, guess what? Here's another headline that's also factual. There are more 30-year-old American women with children than there have ever been at any time in the past. Right? Because there are more 30-year-old American women than there have ever been in the past, both with children and without children, because there's more of them overall. So it really depends on how you word things to get it across, like what's going on. We really shouldn't be focused on birth rate when the total number of people is really what the issue is. And this is a math game, and this is why replacement rate is also kind of a math game. So when you have a country that has a long period of time, and I measured all the different countries and how long each of them were at replacement rate, and the highest was 38 years at replacement level for the island of Curacao, which is, when you look at a lot of these numbers, a lot of the islands will come out as replacement rate for the reason that they need to be self-sustainable and they can't have a high birth rate without running into really major problems. I just wanted to show this map that I made on mapchart.net, and this one has these little islands and microstates with the little circles. I just wanted to show which countries have been at replacement rate for the longest. So I went through all of the years from 1950 to 2021 from the United Nations. This darker color is the countries that have never had any years at replacement rate. And you can see a lot of them are in Africa. Some of them are here in Asia. And it's interesting because some of these countries don't have any years at replacement rate because they've had so much change. And some of them have just been below replacement rate for the most part. But for the most part, they have been above the replacement rate. So most of these countries in Africa, certain places just never got to the replacement rate level. And some of them actually just went right through the replacement rate from very high to very low. So you can see here, Greenland and Greece were countries that have been 30 to 40 years at replacement rate. So this is just to show like where these countries are in the world that have actually had this mythical replacement rate and how long it's been like that. There are a large number of countries that didn't have any years of replacement rate, either because they started off lower and stayed lower, or they started off higher and stayed higher and never went through that replacement rate year. So when I analyzed it, I used from 2 to 2.5 to kind of take into account all of those different types of replacement rates, which are supposed to take into account things like longevity and death rates, which they don't really, because if you look at it in an ideal situation, and this is why I think that the replacement rate is just 2, because in an ideal situation, which is what we should have, then nobody would die before they had children or were of childbearing age, right? Nobody would die. So you shouldn't expect people to die. You shouldn't have children and expect them to die. You really shouldn't have many expectations at all if you have children, right? Imposing expectations on children doesn't work very well. But that's the thing, is like when you have these families that have 15 children, a lot of the reasons why is because they expected a lot of them to die, and a lot of them do die. But this is the thing, is like you can't just have children because you expect them to die, because you will cause them to die by having too many children, because you won't be able to take care of them enough, and you're going to build a society that's going to run into resource deprivation, which will lead to starvation and war, which is why Africa still has so much starvation and war, and it's not going to stop until they go through the demographic shift that we've been talking about, right? And their birth rates have come down overall. But the thing is, like, and just imposing that from the outside, I don't think is ever really going to work. I think it needs to come from within, and that goes for all cultures, is that it's more effective to show how things can work better with a different kind of lifestyle than it is to go and impose your lifestyle on another culture. And this is something that Europeans still haven't figured out. But it's happening more and more. And the fact is that a lot of the low birth rate countries see very well that they're doing better than the high birth rate countries. And they go there to try to change them and to make them understand, look, this is better. But then you get into, like, splitting it down, like, well, what's better, what's worse, right? So anyway, coming back to the replacement rate. So where I'm at now is I see replacement rate is just 2. It's just 2. That's all it is. That's logically, rationally all it ever can be. So I did find that a lot of those countries with a high level of replacement years were more stable. And of course, there's very few countries in the world that are stable. And I classified some of these population lines that I saw as ascending and stable because they showed elements of ascending and then they started to stabilize. And so most of the ascending stable lines were countries that did have a high number of replacement rate years. So there's definitely a correlation. So it definitely is possible to reach that place where 2 children is the limit and the norm, and that would lead to a stable population. Now, the other issue is longevity, right? We know already that higher longevity leads to more people being alive, more people that are included in the total numbers of rates, no matter what rate it is, whether it's unemployment or birth rate or anything else. The more people you have in the total will make the rate look lower of whatever it is you're measuring, because it's just a division, right? This small number divided by the larger number, and the larger number is the total population per capita, right? It doesn't matter what it is. More population in that higher number, in that total number, is going to make whatever you're measuring look lower. Whereas a bunch of people die, then the rate will look higher. So this is why replacement rate isn't a totally bogus idea, but I think what is bogus about it is using the total fertility rate as the point to use replacement level. I think we need to focus on getting an actual number of what is the average number of children that people have in a population. I think that's a much more important calculation to make that unfortunately demographers just aren't doing. They're basing their fertility rate off of birth rates that are highly manipulated into a complex formula. They only involve women. They completely leave men out of the formula. They don't even look at men. And of course, you need men. Men are required in order to reproduce. This is just a fact. We need to start looking at that better and quit putting so much pressure only on women to either have more or less children, which is what a lot of the total fertility rate is about, and therefore the replacement level as well. So the replacement level has even less to do with total fertility rate, and it should be based on the average number of children that people have in a society. Because remember, if you looked at the average number of children that people have in a society, then you would also be including immigrants who have moved to that country with children, because their births are not actually acknowledged when you look at the actual fertility rates. So it's a very, very skewed number where when you look at total fertility rates, you are not actually getting accurate numbers of how many children people actually have. So it's a very dangerous number to use. And so even if we were to use replacement rate, which sort of has some validity because you are replacing yourself if there's two of you and you have two children, right? But you need to base that off of average children per person and not total fertility rate of women, especially because, as I've said, most countries have some gender skewing in their populations. So if you're taking into account migration and things like that, first we need to get the global population down to a sustainable level, which is going to be under 2 billion, possibly under a billion. That's an eighth to like a this is much lower than where we're at now. I consider this to be fact. Of course, people argue all day about it. I think this is just objective biological fact, and you could do the same calculation for any species on Earth. And the argument that like more innovation is going to allow more people to live takes away the basic reasoning that we don't need any more people for any reason, you know? And this is what I wonder about the people that don't believe in overpopulation or think we should have more people. Like, you don't know these other people. What happens when the population gets higher is people actually become more antisocial. So you're not even enjoying these other people that are there, that are alive, that are living halfway across the world. You're never going to meet them. You're never going to hang out with them. They're not your friends. Like, why do you think we should have more of them if you're not personally benefiting from them and their existence in any way, other than from this like really faulty economic system, which is most likely going to completely collapse. When it already has collapsed, it collapses over and over and over again. And we just see that as normal. It goes up and down. We keep wanting it to go up. It keeps collapsing because we can't have it grow and grow and grow. It just doesn't make any sense. So the innovation doesn't help us because there's no reason to have more people. There's no benefit to having a high population that's going to end up wiping out so many other species. And if you care about other species, then you need to put the brakes on having children, because the fact is you cannot control the decisions that your children will make in the future. Teenage rebellion is something that happens. We don't understand it. A lot of people have it. You can be perfectly intelligent and reasonable and understand everything about the world, and your child can still decide to ignore everything you've said. It's just a fact. It's just how it goes. Like, we don't know why that happens. It's just, and that's what I think we've seen too in this generation now, is that sometimes the generation before got it right. And just out of wanting to do things differently, they'll change it all without understanding that it was actually working better before, just because they want to be different, because they want to assert a different kind of identity. You could say, well, we should have then a reduced birth rate until such time as we have a stable and sustainable population, and then it would stay at a stable level through consistent replacement rate of 2 for both men and women, right? That could happen. But the fact is that if you have children young, and I'm coming back to the demographic shift and what I was saying before, if we were to shift things and that people start having children really young and still live to 80, then we would start to see kind of a pile up of people, and we would actually see population growth even with a replacement rate, simply because people keep living, and once you're alive, you're in that total population. So I think that's why replacement rate isn't as certain as we think it might be. I think that we could still have a stable population with a lower birth rate and keep that longevity high and keep the death rate low. Because I see that as like that's ultimately the ideal in which we would have a high quality of life where people live long. And when people live long, they're able to pass on more information. They're able to keep cultures alive for longer. They're able to acquire wisdom and pass that on. You can't have that in a culture where everybody dies young, right? There's no wisdom to pass on. The culture just starts to degrade and collapse because nobody's there to learn from the wisdom and the age of the older generation. So I think longevity is extremely important to encourage that. But in order to have that longevity, the birth rate really does have to be low because otherwise you're getting into major, major conflict. And the worst thing you could ever do is to try to reduce elderly people's existence or life just because you want more room for young people. That's just so twisted and just really gross. So replacement rate can be a sign that a society is fairly healthy because it's kind of what most people do. There is a logic to it that I can understand. Unfortunately, when you say something like replacement rate is 2.3, a lot of people think in their minds that means that they're going to be the one to have 3 kids to bring it up above 2, but they don't need to do that. You know, unless you're from like a culture that's really been horribly genocided, like there's not a lot of reason to have more than 2 children. So I think that the replacement rate has some value. I don't think, however, that we should be using the total fertility rate as a basis for that. I do strongly believe that we need to start really calculating average children per person in a society and not total fertility rate because it's not accurate and it's really giving people the wrong impression of what it really means. And no matter which way you look at it, like having 2 children maximum really does make the most sense. And that would be in a stable population. However, as I said, we're not stable, we're not sustainable. So I think having less than 2 children, so having 1 or no children, is the only responsible thing to do today, especially if you're not from the place you're living in and you know that you're part of a colonial act, either of today or in the past. Then I think you need to really look at the fact that, you know, you're the result of past overpopulation. And the best thing you can do is to just keep your own population a little bit lower and only have 1 or no children. And I think that would sort of resolve a lot of the issues that we're seeing. And I genuinely hope that the population comes down. You know, as I've gone over in previous videos, the birth rates aren't plummeting. They're just more people overall. So any group of people that you look at right now, because the population has grown, will appear to be bigger. There's more conservatives, there's more liberals, there's more gay people, there's more trans people, there's more Muslims, there's more Catholics because there's more people generally, right? If every population is increasing, then every subgroup within that population will also increase. So use some critical thinking when you're reading those headlines that are talking about the population. Start questioning what total fertility rate is. Start questioning why we would need replacement rate if the population is unsustainable. And start making those connections between the environment and the population. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of people's understanding of the environment. Overpopulation has not been debunked. It is happening. It is getting worse. But hopefully that population will stabilize as they're predicting it will. But remember, we're not predicting something that's happening outside of humanity. We're predicting what humanity itself is doing, and you as a human will have an influence on that. So don't let yourself get sucked into this nonsense that birth rates need to be higher, because they really, really don't. And it's perfectly fine if they go below replacement rate, because we live in a global, highly migratory situation right now. And the fact is, if some countries have too high of a birth rate, we will all bear the consequences of that. And it's actually more racist to say that we should have more children in order to have a birth war with those people rather than just to accept that. I mean, I don't really care what skin color people of the future have so long as their quality of life is high. And so every population needs to take that into consideration, that overpopulation really, really is everybody's problem. It's not just one group of people's problem. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I'll be back in a little while. I'm going to keep going through all the different issues on the table for overpopulation. Thanks for your time. This is Kim Anderson.